Okay, now we've kind of got a bit of an idea that the rod's there, it's sitting on top of a pin, and it's that clearance that is everything to it. So we talked a little bit about the lifespan of it and what you can do, or how it fails. Now let's talk about what you can do to keep it going, to make sure that it doesn't wind up like this burnt offering here. When you buy your bike, you obviously get told by the dealer or whoever sold it to you what oil to use. I'm going to say a few things here that might be controversial, but there's only a few oils that I'll use in a two-stroke engine. I like Maxima 927, which is a caster synthetic oil. I like Castrol 747 or A747, and Silcoline KR2, which is now sold as a go-kart oil. But all those three oils are all caster synthetics or caster ester blends, and they offer awesome protection for the bearing. Now, I think most of us are familiar with the oil weights, say SE 240s and straight 60s and straight 30s for gearbox oil. Well, the engine oil for your rings, piston and big end, sort of industry standards 30 weight, but there's 30 weight and then there's 30 weight. The difference is not what it is when it's sitting in a bottle on the shelf, it's about what it is at temperature inside your engine. The engine oil or the bearing that's lubricating your ring and your piston is subjected to quite a few different amounts of heat. Obviously the one up the top of the ring and the piston's got a red hot ball of fire above it. Down the bottom it's not so much a big problem, so you'd think that like the big end doesn't need that good of an oil, but the reality is that you've got that load on it, that 2.5 tons trying to jerk it up and jerk the piston back down. You've got the rotational thing, you've got the heat build up in general coming down from the top, so you got a lot of heat there. So there's a thing you can actually look at which is called the ISO number, which is Society of Engineers method of grading oils. So they measure the oil, how thick it is, how dense it is at certain temperatures, and they try and give it a number for room temperature, which might be 30 weight, and then 40 and 100 degrees centigrade. At 100 degrees centigrade, your 30 weight might be a 10 weight or less with a cheaper oil. The three really good oils I mentioned there, Maxima, I can't remember exactly, you can look this up if you've got nothing to do, but I think the ISO number for Maxima is the highest one, and it's in I think it's around 18. So it's basically gone from 13 to 18 with the temperature. The film strength, and like we were saying before about the pins are rolling and wanting to skid on this surface. The only thing between two bits of metal welding themselves together with that heat and friction is the oil and the cooling effect of the fuel and the oil. So the oil's super important, and the thicker the film strength, the better protected your bearing is. So it's less likely to fail with a really good oil. Now, I mentioned those three brands of oil. They're my favourites. I've used them, I like them. They do a lot of good things. In as much as they protect the bearing, they also do something that's very important for the life of the big end, is protecting the bearing when the bike sits. We have, our sport by nature means that you ride it in the dirt, you wash the bike, you put it on a stand, you let it sit for a week, and then you go and do it again. Unfortunately, we get injured, there's no events, it rains, we don't ride for a few weeks, we leave the bike sit for long periods, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 months, sometimes 10 years with vintage bikes. They're 20 years they're sitting around. So the oil that's in there needs to be able to put a film over all the bearing surfaces and have it hanging in there for a long period of time under some pretty tough conditions. Obviously, we wash the bikes, there's moisture, there's always moisture in the air. A lot of the cheaper oils, and not so much cheaper oils, but synthetic based oils, even some esters, are a little bit prone to absorbing moisture from the air and causing rust on the bearing surface. It's very common with these bikes to actually have a bike that's been sitting but didn't blow up be unusable when we pull it apart to rebuild it. There's actually a little rod here. This is out of a bike that's been sitting for 32 years. You can see it's got some wear on it. And I don't know if you can pick up on that there. That's rust. Rusty oil. Where did it come from? It's come out of the air. So that bearing was completely usable. The bike had been put away. There was nothing wrong with it. If you can see in there, there's rust in there. What happened to the oil? There was plenty of oil on it when it stopped. Whatever oil was used back in the day in 1978 when this bike got parked, it didn't cut it. It has let the rust get to, or the moisture get to the bearing surfaces, and if we were to ride that bike, like you could, even with that rust in the little end, the bike would probably start. As soon as it starts, there's fresh oil and fresh misting lubrication in there, and it'd run. And it'd probably sound fine for a short period of time until that rust wore off, and you put it on some load, and the rollers, little end rollers or big end rollers, will be rolling across an uneven, pitted surface, and the pits will give up their edges and cause the bearing to skid, and it'll start that whole evolution process very quickly. We always hear stories about a guy let his 250, there was a guy who rebuilt a KX 250 two-stroke 88 model for this week, and he bought me the crank to repair it or rebuild it because it had been sitting for 10 years, and he pulled it apart, found something like this, knew what it was straight away, has to get a new rod. There's no getting around it. There's no fingers crossed she'll be right. There's two rides, or one ride or two rides in it, and then this will turn into that. Particularly if you're revving it hard and you're too dumb to stop when you feel it slow down or hear the knocking noise. So that's why I recommend those three oils. There are other oils, they're great oils. I've used and been sponsored by a lot of different companies for the race teams. Obviously Castrol sponsors a long time. They tried to get us to use, or we did actually develop two-stroke oils for them. If I had a choice, I'd still pick that A747 because I know it's the best oil. Protects the bearings better against the moisture. It's not hydroscopic. Got the best film strength. Some of the synthetics have really good film strength, but they have bad or not as good prevention of rust. So I'm kind of a realist. I understand that these bikes don't get ridden every day. So a lot of the advertising you'll hear from somebody like with an expensive oil, they'll tell you how much better these are, and you can run them at lower ratios. So we'll talk about ratios. The bottom line is that you need that film strength, and the running. If you can actually go online and look up calculators that they have for road racing go-kart guys, and that love them. If you plug in your RPM range, and they'll tell you what amount of oil you need with your fuel for that RPM range. And at Yamaha, they did extensive studies on this, dyno stuff, testing, a lot of information gathered over a couple of years, and they recommended for a long time, I don't know what they recommend now, but back in the day they developed Yamalube, and they developed a ratio for that, and on a YZ250 it was 30-1, or you often hear 30-1, Kawasaki say 33-1, some of the others say 32-1. So they've all zeroed in on that same ratio. But again, that ratio will change. The better oil you use, maybe you don't have to use as much of it to get the same numbers. But the long and the short of it is that if you're revving the bike, you need a better oil. If you're revving the bike, you need more oil. So things like your KDM 85, I don't actually understand what the hell was going on at KDM and MotorX when they're saying to run them at 50 and 60 to 1 or whatever. That's just insanity. And we see a lot of KDM 125s and 85s and 65s with dead cranks, probably because they're trying to run them that lean. The only explanation I have for something like that in a manual is they got some young guys in there who've done a bunch of scientific study and they've come up with that number. They haven't used the real world syndrome where they will push the bikes in the real world and then store the bikes. They probably did dyno testing and they got more horsepower with slightly less oil, or they got less smoke, less emissions, and they have to have a blanket ratio to recommend everybody for registered and unregistered bikes. I really don't know how they got that. If I've got a KDM 85 or 65, it's 30 to 1 and I don't care what it says in the manual. And I really would suggest if you got a kid on a 50, 60, 80, 125 that you use one of those three oils I mentioned and you use it at 30 to 1, and that'll give you your best protection against winding up like this. There are other factors that can cause the bearing to fail prematurely. Like I just mentioned then, obviously the oil, the type of oil, whether you let the bike sit, what ratio you're mixing it. And while we're talking about mixing, have to talk about fuel. Now we mentioned before how when the piston comes up and the ignition comes on, it sparks and the explosion pushes the rod down. Unfortunately in two-strokes, they detonate. What actually happens is when they put a lot of load on them, poor quality fuel, run them a little bit lean and the top of the piston gets hot, you get detonation, which is as the piston's coming up, it starts to, little bits around the edge of the piston that are really hot will ignite the fuel before the spark plug goes off. So as it's trying to go up, those little explosions out on the edge of the expansion, edge of the combustion chamber, are pushing it. That knocking noise, that's the little explosions. And they're hammering on the bearing, squeezing the oil out between it and the pin just before it gets to that peak load period. So not a cool thing. So detonation will shorten the life of a big end bearing, and in extreme conditions will cause it to fail, and definitely a lot of little end failures are blamed on detonation. Now the fuel thing, obviously higher octane, the reason they use the octane rating is about the detonation, or how tolerant it is, or how much pressure it can take before it detonates. The higher the number the better, so I recommend 98 fuel for everything. I always again read shit on the internet about how they design them for 95 and they run better for 95. Maybe that's true, but I know for sure they detonate a lot more on 95 than they'll detonate on 98. Back in the day, I was telling somebody on the net the other day a story that when they took leaded fuel out of Grand Prix road racing, caused a big stink. It made it more expensive because it shortened the life of big ends, so you had to change your big end roughly 2.5 times more often than without it, because the detonation was putting the load on the bearing, and those bikes have been designed to just do the job, just get those, few thousand kilometres of track time, and then they would change it. They changed over to unleaded fuel and they were shitting themselves in less than a third, or around about the third of the life that they were 2 weeks before when they had leaded fuel. And it was detonation. Road races Not something I've done a lot of, but they use a lot of technology, and a lot of the bikes back then used to have a thing called a detonation counter or a det meter, and that was basically a load cell under the spark plug. When it detonate, it would try and push the piston down, and it'd try to push the spark plug thread out the thread. So they put a load cell under the spark plug. When the spark plug was moving, flexing from the detonation, they could count it. And I remember seeing that on a normal fuel, it would detonate a few hundred times a second. On unleaded fuel, it was detonating a couple of thousand times a second. So they had to reduce the compression, increase piston to head clearance, and they lost power, and they had to do that to save the piston from being damaged and save the big end bearings. But the long and the short of that for us is higher octane fuel is your only insurance. That's why I say to everybody that I build a race engine for, if you're serious about it and you want the best power, you can reduce the piston to head clearance, you can increase the compression. But if you're going to run pump gas, and with the pump gas there's always a bit of variation, it's not as good as it was last week, this week, you can't trust that. You need to have the best quality fuel you get, and that's racing fuel. You get your RU 99 and RU 100 for MA approved racing. There are other fuels that are even better for it, but they're all expensive. Fuel, unfortunately, is, it's getting around 10, 12, $13 a litre for race fuel. People can't afford that. It's 10 times as expensive as pump gas. So 99% of people are running pump gas. 99% of people are going to have their life of their big end shortened by running it. That's just a fact. All right, the other thing that can shorten the life of that big end, that's a talking point, is air filter maintenance. You got all those components, you got the pins, they only have that really close tolerance. If you're riding at a place like Amcross, down at Picton or Goulburn, whatever, quite often those events have dust, and dust gets pulled through the filter, the dust dries out the oil on the surface of the foam and then finds its way in the engine. You get a light breeze of dust through there, it mixes with the oil, it makes a grinding paste. What's it grinding? Well, it's grinding your rings, your bore, your piston, and your big end bearing. So it's reducing the diameter of your pins, wrecking the surface of your rod, wrecking the surface of the crank pin, and accelerating it down that road from new to dead. So how badly you dusted it, how long's a piece of string. You can dust it a little bit, you maybe don't even know you dusted it because you put an air filter in at lunchtime and you're in a bit of a rush, you didn't see it. You have shortened the life of the bike when you dust it. If you dust it good a few times, it can just destroy it. I know, again, just like the storing the bike story, I've had it where when I was a very young mechanic for a guy called Alex Kiddis in Queensland, I think it was about the first race meeting I did with him, the air filter fell off. I didn't do the screws up correctly, and I actually did the screws up finger tight, reached down to wipe my hand with a rag because I had air filter stuff on it, and instead of grabbing a screwdriver and tightening the screws, I put the cover back on. Air filter fell off mid-race. That crank was gone in 20 minutes at a race in Queensland in pretty dusty conditions, but only took 20 minutes with the air filter sitting off a crack. So I learnt my lesson there. You can't have dust go through the motor. You can't save it, and you can't trust it, because even if you think you've gotten away with it, that wear's going to catch up with you somewhere down the track. You might have jumped from here to here, and your next ride or the ride after, you're dead. Okay, another thing that really influences the life of the big end is the jetting. Obviously, the only way lubrication gets here is through the carburetor. So the smaller the jet, the less oil, the less fuel. The less oil, the less fuel probably means you're running lean, and that means higher temperatures. So higher temperature, less lubrication, probably leading to detonation as well. All big factor. So there you go. You're shortening it with maybe shooting dirt in there, maybe getting detonation from bad fuel. If you run it a bit lean, the engine runs hotter, you get more detonation, you're shortening the life of it. I think these 85s are a little bit prone to it. At one stage they had different slots in them. They had a smaller slot and they opened up the slot, made it a bit bigger to allow more fuel through to the bearings, hopefully cooling them, hopefully lubricating them. Okay, so the jetting is a factor. And then the last thing I think that people will think of is how hard the bike's being revved and what sort of load it's under. You can probably ride around at a track, a hard clay style track out the back of Mudgee somewhere for 100 hours on this rod and not have any real wear. You can take the same bike and try to ride it for 100 hours at Braidwood or Coolum in the sand where it's moist, deep, hard driving conditions for the bike. The extra load you put on the bike and the extra revs, because you're holding it wide open all the time, will wear it out quicker. So it's only got a finite life. Just like your car tyre, if you have a tyre on your car, you know it's going to last 50,000 kilometres and then it's worn out. Now if you do burnouts and drive faster, it'll wear out quicker. Or if you turn corners sharply and put more side load on it, it'll wear the tread down quicker. It's the same with the big end bearing. If the kid revs the bike harder, if the bike gets ridden in sand, it's going to wear out the big end quicker. So you might have gotten 120 hours out of your last rod because you did all your riding on a track at your house that was never ripped deep. And now the kid's racing more, you're travelling around and you're doing training down at Mossie's and he's ripping the track. Or you're riding at Coolum and you've never ridden before. You can ride at Stanmore Park in Queensland till the cows come home. You wear out tyres and drain fuel through the bike, but you're not going to put as much load on the bike as if you rode at Coolum and did the same amount of time. Your tyres will be fine, but you're going to go through twice as much fuel. You're going to rev the bike twice as much and you're going to wear your cranks out twice as fast. Alright, so I think you can understand now it's a pretty complex thing. So why did my big end go? Have you ever dusted it? What oil are you using? What ratio are you using? What fuel are you using? Are you looking after your jetting? Are you keeping track of the hours? Because like I said, KDM 85, for example, the size of the rod and the revs at the bike, or the rod bearing and the pins, and the amount of revving that it does, or where it produces its power to be ridden correctly. With a guy that rides the bike hard, 50 to 70 hours is probably about the end of the life for one of those rods. The less your kid revs the bike, the longer it'll last. The different conditions may extend it or reduce it, but I do know for sure after about 70 hours we start to see them more and more like this. One of my friends got 230 hours out of a KDM 85 rod and it looked fine at the end. Other guys can't get to 70 hours, and the difference is how hard the bike gets ridden, how hard it gets revved, and what the surface is that it's going in. You add all those other factors in, fuel quality that offers detonation protection, jetting the bike correctly, or just leaving it go a bit lean, all can shorten it. So it's a real complicated thing. Probably one last subject that was brought up was the quality of the rods. I generally only like to use OEM rods. I don't mind the Pro X rod kits. They're made in Japan. Probably some of the rods that I think Honda and Suzuki and Yamaha use are made in the same place. Things like Carrillo rods for 4-strokes, they're made by Plankel, which makes all of the or many of the KTM rods and parts now. And probably the last one I'll probably pick is Wasner. Obviously good quality stuff. The Germans know how to make a piece of steel. There's other brands of rod that are cheaper. Quite often guys I'll tell them it's $280 for a Pro X rod kit for their bike, for a full-size bike, and they'll think I can get it cheaper, and they come back with something in a brand that I've never even heard of, with made in Taiwan or made in China written on the box. The actual production that goes into one of these rods and the number of steps to get it from a shovel full of dirt to that is incredible. You have to have a lot of patience and a lot of dedication to perfection to get a product like that. And there's steps in there that, it not done right, you get a broken rod or one that'll wear prematurely. So I've got a lot of faith in the Germans and the Japanese to build a good product like that. I don't have the same amount of faith in some of the other countries around the world. Okay, I hope that explains conrod bearing failures, and I know this has gone on and dragged on for a long time. I don't know if I'll break it up into parts or just post it in one big long video. I hope I haven't rattled on too long, and if you think I've made a mistake or I've misquoted myself, or I'm just basically crazy because I didn't recommend another brand of oil or something, post something in the comments or contact me through the website and I'll talk about it. I love to be proven wrong. That's the number one reason why I love this sport and love the technical side of it. You never stop learning, and you can always learn something new. And like I said, if you think you know it all, you'd stop. I don't know it all. I know a bit. I love talking about it. I love thinking about it, and I love getting it right in my own mind. So I hope that shares something with you, and I'll talk to you guys soon. See ya.